The silence that fell over the Valecrest dining room on Sunday, August 22, 1852, wasn't the peaceful quiet of Sabbath evening. It was the stillness that comes after screaming stops and prayers turn to pleas. Around the hand-carved oak table that had hosted countless family gatherings, 7 bodies sat slumped in their chairs, their faces twisted in expressions of agony that no amount of frontier toughness could mask. The horror of that night would echo through the Colorado Territory for generations, but the truth behind it began in the sweltering kitchen of Copper Ridge Ranch, where a woman named Elmira Fenwick watched steam rise from the Sunday roast that would carry death to the most powerful family in 3 counties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of August 23rd dawned blood red across the Colorado Territory, the sun filtering through smoke from distant wildfires that had been burning for weeks. But at Copper Ridge Ranch, the acrid smell in the air wasn't coming from any forest blaze. It was the stench of death, thick and cloying, seeping from the windows of the grand dining room where the Valecrest family had gathered for their final meal. Sheriff Nelson Velthar received word of the catastrophe just after sunrise, when a terrified ranch hand named Tobias rode his horse nearly to death, covering the 12 miles between Copper Ridge and the town of Millhaven. The man's eyes were wild with the kind of terror that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't be possible in God's creation, his voice breaking as he stammered out details that made no earthly sense. "They're all dead, Sheriff," Tobias gasped, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his hat. The whole family, their guests, even little Miss Kyla, just sitting there around the table like they fell asleep, except for their faces. Sweet Jesus, their faces. What Velthar found when he arrived at Copper Ridge would haunt him for the rest of his days as a lawman. The Valecrest dining room had been transformed into a macabre tableau. 7 bodies arranged around a table still set with the finest china money could buy in the Colorado Territory. Master Arendor Valecrest sat at the head of the table, his usually commanding presence reduced to a grotesque mask of pain, his fingers still clutched around a silver fork that would never again taste food. His wife, Callista Valecrest, had collapsed sideways in her chair, her elaborate Sunday dress spread around her like spilled wine. Their daughter Kyla, barely 16, and the pride of 3 counties, lay with her face pressed against the mahogany table, her golden hair fanned across plates that still held the remnants of what should have been a celebration of family prosperity. The guests told their own story of horror. Judge Elias Varick, who had traveled from Denver specifically for this Sunday dinner, sat frozen in eternal judgment, his gavel-wielding hand now powerless against the justice that had been served at this table. His wife, Maeva Varick, had managed to rise from her chair before the poison claimed her, her body found crumpled near the door, as if she had tried desperately to escape the fate that was already coursing through her veins. The ranch foreman, Aaron Crestvale, had been granted the rare privilege of dining with the family that evening, a reward for his years of faithful service. Now he slumped in his chair like a broken puppet, his weather-beaten face contorted in an expression that spoke of betrayal as much as agony. Most unsettling of all was the presence of Dr. Carl Malrick, Millhaven's only physician, who had been attending the dinner as both guest and friend. His medical bag lay open beside his chair, testament to his desperate attempts to diagnose and treat what was systematically killing everyone around him. His notebook, recovered later by investigators, contained a hastily scrawled entry that would prove crucial to understanding what had occurred. Acute gastric distress, cardiac irregularities, possible strychnine poisoning. No antidote available. God preserve us all. The dining room itself told the story of a celebration that had turned into a nightmare with shocking suddenness. Crystal glasses still held traces of expensive wine, imported at great cost from California. Silver serving dishes contained the remains of an elaborate feast. Roasted beef with herbs, fresh vegetables from the ranch garden, bread still warm from the oven. At the center of the table, a magnificent cake sat untouched, its white frosting decorated with sugar roses that had been crafted to commemorate what should have been a joyous occasion. But it was the smaller details that revealed the true horror of what had transpired. Overturned chairs showed where desperate attempts had been made to flee. Spilled water indicated frantic efforts to dilute whatever poison was destroying their bodies from within. Scratches on the polished mahogany surface revealed where fingernails had clawed for purchase, as the victims fought against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. Sheriff Velthar was a practical man who had dealt with his share of frontier violence. Claim jumpers shot over disputed mining rights, cattle rustlers hanged from convenient trees, saloon brawls that ended with bullets instead of fists. But this was different. This spoke of premeditation, of careful planning, of someone with intimate knowledge of the family's routines and access to their most private moments. The investigation began immediately, though it was hampered by the remote location of Copper Ridge Ranch and the limited resources available in territorial Colorado. Velthar called for assistance from federal marshals in Denver, but he knew it would be days before help arrived. In the meantime, he had to secure the scene and begin questioning the surviving members of the ranch staff. What he discovered in those first crucial hours would shake his faith in everything he thought he understood about human nature. The Valecrest family had been pillars of the community, respected throughout the territory for their success in cattle ranching and their generous contributions to local churches and schools. Arendor Valecrest had served as a territorial representative, advocating for Colorado's eventual statehood. His wife, Callista, had organized charitable events that fed struggling families during harsh winters. Yet as Velthar questioned the ranch hands, stable workers, and domestic staff, a different picture began to emerge. Stories of casual cruelty disguised as discipline, accounts of wages withheld for minor infractions, descriptions of working conditions that pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Most disturbing were the testimonies about the treatment of Elmira Fenwick, the family's cook, and the one person who had been responsible for preparing every meal that entered the Valecrest dining room. Multiple witnesses spoke of her visible distress in recent weeks, her tear-stained face during meal preparation, her fearful responses to increasingly harsh criticism of her cooking. But Elmira herself was nowhere to be found. Her small quarters behind the kitchen stood empty, her few possessions gone, her narrow bed stripped of its simple linens. Like smoke from a dying fire, she had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Colorado Territory, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of death in the kitchen where she had served her final meal. The physical evidence told its own story. In the kitchen, investigators found traces of a white powder scattered near the spice rack, along with an empty tin that had once contained rat poison purchased from Millhaven's general store just 2 weeks earlier. The ranch's extensive records showed that Arendor Valecrest had authorized the purchase himself, complaining about vermin in the grain storage areas. None of the investigating officers asked what could drive a woman to transform Sunday dinner into an execution chamber. None wondered what accumulation of daily humiliations might push someone past the point where mercy seemed possible. They saw only the crime, not the circumstances that had created the criminal. As word of the massacre spread throughout the territory, it sent shockwaves through communities that had always assumed their positions of power made them untouchable. If the Valecrest family could be destroyed by someone they had trusted with their daily bread, what did that say about the security of every prominent household from Denver to Colorado Springs? The hunt for Elmira Fenwick was about to begin, but she had already achieved something that would outlast any capture or punishment. She had proven that in the American West, justice could be served cold as mountain snow and just as inevitable as winter itself. August 1852 marked the height of the Colorado Gold Rush, when fortune seekers flooded into the territory chasing dreams of wealth buried in mountain streams and rocky hillsides. The discovery of gold near present-day Denver had transformed the region from a sparse collection of trading posts and Native American hunting grounds into a bustling frontier society where fortunes could be made or lost in a single season. But while thousands of prospectors panned for gold with frozen fingers and desperate hopes, a different kind of wealth was being built by men like Arendor Valecrest. Cattle ranching had proven more reliable than mining, providing steady income to those smart enough to claim the best grazing lands before the stampede of settlers made such acquisitions impossible. Copper Ridge Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Colorado Territory grassland, encompassing valley floors where cattle grew fat on abundant grass and mountain meadows that provided summer pasture when the lower elevations became too dry. The ranch headquarters sat in a natural amphitheater surrounded by red rock formations that gave the property its name, the buildings arranged in a compound that spoke of prosperity earned through shrewdness and maintained through iron control. The main house dominated the complex, a two-story structure built from local sandstone and timber hauled down from mountain forests. Its design reflected Arendor Valecrest's ambitions more than frontier practicality, with bay windows that required expensive glass shipped from St. Louis, hardwood floors that demanded constant maintenance in the dusty climate, and a dining room large enough to seat 20 guests at the massive oak table that served as the centerpiece of the family's social life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Surrounding the main house were the practical buildings that made ranch operations possible. Bunkhouses for the cowboys who worked the cattle, barns for horses and equipment, corrals where livestock could be sorted and branded, and the maze of smaller structures that housed the domestic staff, who kept the Valecrest household functioning. The kitchen occupied its own building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, an arrangement that provided some protection against fire, while ensuring that cooking odors and heat didn't intrude on the family's living spaces. The social hierarchy at Copper Ridge reflected the broader structure of territorial Colorado, where success was measured in land ownership and the ability to command the labor of others. At the top sat the Valecrest family, their position secured by legal ownership of everything within the ranch boundaries. Below them came the foremen and skilled workers whose expertise made the operation profitable. At the bottom were the domestic servants and unskilled laborers, whose daily toil supported everyone above them. This pyramid of power was maintained through a combination of economic dependence and social isolation. Ranch workers lived in company housing, bought supplies from the company store, and found their social lives centered around company events. Those who questioned the system found themselves without work or shelter in a territory where both were difficult to obtain independently. The nearest town, Millhaven, sat 12 miles east of the ranch along a wagon road that became impassable during spring snowmelt and autumn rains. Founded to serve the mining camps scattered throughout the surrounding hills, Millhaven had evolved into a supply center for the agricultural operations that were proving more sustainable than gold extraction. The town's main street featured the essential businesses of frontier life, a general store that sold everything from flour to farming equipment, a saloon that served as social center and informal courthouse, a church that provided moral guidance and community gatherings, and a handful of other establishments that catered to the practical needs of settlers trying to build permanent lives in challenging circumstances. Law enforcement in territorial Colorado was a patchwork affair, with federal marshals covering vast distances between widely scattered settlements and local sheriffs attempting to maintain order in communities that often had more weapons than laws. The territorial government in Denver provided legal framework, but practical justice was usually administered by whoever had the most guns and the strongest will to use them. This system worked reasonably well for crimes of passion or disputes between equals, but it struggled with cases involving complex power relationships or systematic abuse. A ranch owner who cheated his workers might face angry confrontation, but rarely legal consequences. A merchant who sold spoiled goods could lose customers, but wouldn't likely see jail time. The frontier justice system was designed to handle dramatic violations of community standards, not the subtle cruelties that occurred behind closed doors. Into this world had come thousands of immigrants, seeking opportunities unavailable in the more established states back east. Some were drawn by gold fever, others by cheap land, still others by the promise of social mobility that the frontier seemed to offer. They brought with them the prejudices and assumptions of their origins, but also the desperate hope that hard work in a new place might lead to better lives for themselves and their families. Among these hopeful migrants were significant numbers of people whose legal status remained ambiguous in the territories. The Compromise of 1850 had left questions about slavery in the Western Territories partially unresolved, creating a legal gray area that allowed various forms of bound labor to persist, even in regions where slavery was theoretically prohibited. Some were indentured servants working off the cost of their passage west. Others were individuals fleeing debt or legal troubles in eastern states, willing to work for minimal wages in exchange for protection from pursuing creditors. Still others were members of ethnic minorities who found themselves economically trapped by discrimination and limited opportunities. Elmira Fenwick belonged to this shadow population, her exact legal status unclear even to herself. She had arrived at Copper Ridge Ranch 5 years earlier as part of a group of workers recruited by Valecrest during a business trip to Kansas. The terms of her employment had been vague, involving promises of wages that never seemed to accumulate into actual money she could spend freely. Whether she was technically a slave, an indentured servant, or simply an employee trapped by circumstance and debt was a distinction that mattered more to lawyers than to anyone living the reality of her situation. What mattered was that she could not leave Copper Ridge Ranch without permission, could not seek other employment, and could not make decisions about her own life without considering how they would affect her standing with the Valecrest family. The kitchen where she spent her days was a monument to the contradictions of frontier prosperity. Equipped with the finest cast-iron stoves money could buy, stocked with spices imported at enormous expense from distant markets, designed to produce meals that could rival anything served in the grand hotels of San Francisco or Chicago. Yet the woman who created these culinary masterpieces lived in a space barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, ate the leftover scraps from meals she had prepared for others, and wore the same 3 dresses until they fell apart from constant use. She was simultaneously essential to the family's social standing and utterly expendable as a human being. This was the world that had shaped Elmira Fenwick's understanding of justice, fairness, and the value of human life. A world where her skills were praised when they produced results, but where she herself remained invisible. A world where the difference between prosperity and destitution, between security and vulnerability, between life and death, could be determined by the whims of people who regarded her as barely more human than the cattle that grazed in their fields. Understanding this context is crucial to comprehending the events of August 22, 1852. What happened in the Valecrest dining room that night was not the spontaneous act of a deranged individual, but the inevitable result of a system that created impossible tensions and offered no legitimate means of resolving them. The Colorado Territory of 1852 was a place where fortunes could be made and lost overnight, where justice was often indistinguishable from vengeance, and where the line between civilization and barbarism remained dangerously thin. It was exactly the kind of environment where someone with nothing left to lose might decide that the only remaining choice was between dying as a victim or living as a perpetrator. In this harsh landscape, Elmira Fenwick had learned lessons that would serve her well in the terrible days to come. Elmira Fenwick possessed the kind of beauty that frontier hardship had not yet managed to completely erase, though 5 years of servitude at Copper Ridge Ranch had left their mark in the premature lines around her dark eyes and the calluses that rough work had carved into her once delicate hands. At 28, she moved through the kitchen with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to work efficiently in cramped spaces, her movements economical and precise as she navigated between cast-iron stoves and preparation tables loaded with ingredients for the elaborate meals that maintained the Valecrest family's reputation for hospitality. Her arrival at Copper Ridge in 1847 had been the result of circumstances that she rarely discussed with anyone, though fragments of her story occasionally emerged during the late-night conversations that domestic staff shared when the main house was dark and their work was finally done. She had been born in Virginia to a family of free blacks who had managed to establish a small farm outside Richmond, her early years marked by the relative security that came from legal freedom and modest prosperity. The collapse of that security had come swiftly and without warning when a business partner defaulted on loans that her father had co-signed, leaving the family responsible for debts that consumed not only their farm but everything else they owned. Faced with a choice between debtors, prison, and westward migration, Elmira's father had accepted Valecrest's offer of employment in exchange for passage to Colorado Territory and forgiveness of the outstanding obligations. What had been presented as an opportunity for a fresh start in a new land had gradually revealed itself as something much more restrictive. The promised wages never materialized in any form that allowed for true economic independence, while the isolated location of the ranch and the legal ambiguities of territorial law made escape or complaint nearly impossible. Elmira's father had died during her second year at Copper Ridge, succumbing to pneumonia after a winter spent working cattle in conditions that would have challenged men half his age. Her mother had followed him within months, worn down by grief and the grinding demands of endless domestic labor. Their deaths had left Elmira alone in a household where she was simultaneously indispensable and powerless. Her skills as a cook making her too valuable to dismiss while her legal status made her too vulnerable to resist. The kitchen where she spent her days had become both sanctuary and prison, a space where her talents could flourish even as her freedom withered. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to transform basic ingredients into culinary masterpieces that earned praise from guests who traveled hundreds of miles to sample her creations. Territorial politicians planned their visits to Copper Ridge around her Sunday dinners, and Denver businessmen arranged deals specifically to secure invitations to meals prepared by what they called Valecrest's secret weapon. Her reputation extended far beyond the ranch boundaries, carried by travelers who spoke of meals that could make strong men weep with appreciation. The governor of Kansas Territory had once offered to buy her services for his own household, an offer that Valecrest had declined with the satisfaction of a man who understood that true wealth lay in controlling things that others coveted but could not obtain. But culinary genius could not protect Elmira from the daily humiliations that defined her existence at Copper Ridge Ranch. She woke each morning at 4 o'clock to begin preparations for the day's meals, working by candlelight in a kitchen that grew stifling hot during summer months and remained barely heated during Colorado winters. Her days were filled with the endless repetition of chopping, mixing, seasoning, and cooking, interrupted only by the increasingly frequent criticism from Callista Valecrest, who had appointed herself the judge of every dish that emerged from the kitchen. Callista's attention to culinary matters had intensified over the past year, driven by her social ambitions and her growing awareness that her husband's political aspirations depended partly on their ability to entertain influential guests in appropriate style. What had once been casual oversight had evolved into obsessive micromanagement, with Callista appearing in the kitchen at all hours to taste sauces, critique seasoning choices, and demand changes to menus that had been planned days in advance. The criticism had grown increasingly personal and harsh, moving beyond professional standards to attacks on Elmira's character, intelligence, and basic humanity. Mistakes that would once have earned a brief reprimand now resulted in hours-long lectures about gratitude, proper behavior, and the consequences of disappointing the family that had shown such generosity in providing her with food and shelter. More troubling were the conversations that Elmira could not help overhearing as she moved through the main house during her duties. The Valecrest family discussed her as they might discuss livestock, evaluating her usefulness, speculating about her replacement, and debating whether the cost of maintaining her services was justified by the benefits she provided. These discussions had taken on new urgency in recent months as Valecrest's business interests expanded beyond cattle ranching into mining speculation and territorial politics. His frequent absences from the ranch had left Callista in charge of household management, a responsibility she approached with the systematic thoroughness of someone determined to prove her competence through aggressive cost-cutting and efficiency improvements. Elmira had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated her standing within the household, the quality of ingredients provided for her use, the frequency of complaints about her work, the tone of voice used when giving her instructions. All of these measures had been trending downward for months, suggesting that her position at Copper Ridge Ranch was becoming increasingly precarious. The isolation of her situation was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of her servitude. The other ranch employees regarded her with a mixture of envy and suspicion, seeing her relative privilege in being assigned to kitchen work rather than outdoor labor, while remaining unaware of the psychological pressures that came with constant scrutiny and criticism. The ranch hands who worked with cattle and horses had each other for companionship and support, but Elmira's duties kept her largely separate from the social networks that helped others endure the hardships of frontier life. Her only real confidant was Jasmine Orville, an elderly woman who helped with laundry and cleaning duties and who had developed a maternal concern for Elmira's welfare. Jasmine had her own history of loss and displacement, having been separated from her family during the chaos of westward migration, and subsequently finding herself dependent on the questionable generosity of employers who understood that her advanced age and lack of alternatives made her unlikely to seek other opportunities. The conversations between these two women, conducted in whispered tones during stolen moments between their endless duties, provided Elmira with the only emotional support available to her. Jasmine had seen enough of frontier life to understand the precarious nature of their situation, and she had begun expressing concerns about changes in the household atmosphere that suggested trouble ahead. Those concerns had proven justified when Callista Valecrest announced her intention to modernize the kitchen operations, by hiring a professionally trained cook from Denver and reassigning Elmira to general domestic duties. The announcement had been presented as an efficiency improvement, but everyone understood that it represented a fundamental change in Elmira's status within the household. The prospect of losing her position as cook meant more than just a change in duties. It meant the loss of the one area where her skills provided some protection against arbitrary dismissal or worse treatment. It meant increased vulnerability in a situation where she already possessed few rights and limited options for redress when those rights were violated. More immediately threatening was the knowledge that Valecrest had been making inquiries about the market value of skilled domestic workers in mining camps throughout the territory. These conversations, overheard through thin walls and reported by sympathetic staff members, suggested that economic pressures might soon force decisions about which employees were essential and which could be sold to recover operating capital. The legal ambiguities that had allowed Elmira to be brought to Colorado territory in the first place also made it possible for her to be transferred to new owners without her consent, a form of human trafficking that flourished in the spaces between territorial jurisdictions and conflicting federal laws. Faced with these mounting pressures and with nowhere to turn for help or protection, Elmira had begun to understand that her survival might depend on taking action that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The woman who had once dreamed of freedom and dignity had been systematically stripped of both, leaving her with only one resource that could not be taken away: her intimate knowledge of the family that had consumed 5 years of her life. In the kitchen where she had created countless masterpieces for the pleasure of others, Elmira Fenwick was about to prepare her final meal as the Valecrest family cook. It would be a dish that no one who tasted it would ever forget. The first direct threat to Elmira's precarious existence at Copper Ridge Ranch came during the scorching afternoon of August 10, 1852, when Callista Valecrest summoned her to the main house parlor for what was euphemistically termed a, quote, household conference. The formal setting itself should have served as warning enough, since their previous interactions had taken place in the kitchen or other work areas where Elmira's presence could be explained by her duties rather than any suggestion that she warranted the courtesy of a proper meeting. Callista sat rigid in her favorite velvet chair, her posture reflecting the finishing school education that had taught her to regard proper deportment as a weapon of social control. Her pale hands, soft from a lifetime of avoiding manual labor, held a leather-bound ledger that contained the household accounts, though Elmira suspected the real purpose of the meeting had little to do with financial record-keeping. "Elmira," Callista began, her voice carrying the particular tone of false kindness that preceded most unpleasant announcements, "Mr. Valecrest and I have been reviewing the household expenses, and we've identified several areas where improvements in efficiency could benefit everyone involved." The ledger remained closed throughout this introduction, confirming Elmira's suspicion that the specific numbers were less important than the general principle being established. She had learned to listen carefully to the spaces between words during conversations with the Valecrest family, understanding that the most crucial information was often contained in what remained unsaid rather than what was explicitly stated. "We've been discussing the possibility of bringing in additional staff to help with kitchen operations," Callista continued, her tone suggesting that this development should be viewed as good news rather than the threat it obviously represented. "There's a professionally trained cook in Denver who comes highly recommended by the Thornfield family, and we think she could help modernize our approaches to menu planning and food preparation." The mention of the Thornfield family carried particular weight in territorial Colorado society, since their ranch operation was considered the gold standard for combining profitability with social sophistication. Any comparison to Thornfield practices was intended to establish that the proposed changes represented advancement rather than arbitrary decision-making. But Elmira understood immediately that additional staff was a polite fiction designed to obscure what was actually being proposed. Kitchens the size of Copper Ridge's were designed around single-cook operations, with support staff handling preparation and cleanup, while one person maintained control over seasoning, timing, and final presentation. Adding a, quote, professionally trained cook would inevitably result in reassigning the current cook to other duties, or eliminating her position entirely. Of course, Callista added with the casual cruelty that characterized her approach to household management, "We would find other ways for you to contribute to the ranch operations. There's always plenty of work to be done, and we wouldn't want anyone to feel that their years of service had gone unappreciated." The euphemistic language could not disguise the fundamental reality being communicated. After 5 years of building a reputation as one of the finest cooks in 3 counties, after creating the culinary foundation for the Valecrest family's social and political success, After sacrificing her health and youth to master skills that required both artistic talent and technical precision, Elmira was being informed that her services were no longer required in the capacity that gave her life meaning and provided her only source of protection against even worse treatment. The conversation that followed revealed additional layers of threat that made her situation even more precarious. Callista spoke casually about the various opportunities that might be available for domestic workers in other parts of the territory, mentioning mining camps and frontier settlements where skilled help was desperately needed and where employers were willing to pay premium prices for reliable service. These opportunities were presented as potential benefits, chances for Elmira to experience new places and expand her professional horizons. But anyone familiar with conditions in mining camps understood that such positions typically involved working 18-hour days in primitive conditions for men whose respect for women's safety and dignity was minimal at best. More ominously, Callista mentioned conversations her husband had been having with business associates, who were always looking for skilled domestic help and who understood the complexities of employment arrangements in territorial situations. The careful phrasing made it clear that Elmira's future might be determined by commercial transactions rather than personal choice, her fate decided by whoever offered the best price for her services. The legal framework that made such transactions possible was deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of debt obligations, employment contracts, and territorial regulations that few people fully understood. But the practical result was simple enough. Elmira could be transferred to new owners whenever economic pressures or personal convenience made such transfers desirable. The timeline for these changes was presented as flexible, dependent on various factors including the availability of replacement staff and the completion of pending business arrangements. But Callista's tone suggested that decisions had already been made, and that the current conversation was more about notification than negotiation. "We thought it would be appropriate to give you time to prepare for these transitions," Callista concluded with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had handled a difficult situation with admirable sensitivity. Change can be challenging, but it often leads to opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available. The dismissal was courteous but final, leaving Elmira to return to her kitchen duties with the knowledge that her world was about to be destroyed through a combination of economic calculation and casual indifference to her welfare. The skills that had made her indispensable were apparently not indispensable enough to protect her from being discarded when maintaining her position became inconvenient. Over the following days, additional details of the family's plans emerged through overheard conversations and sympathetic reports from other staff members. The professionally trained cook from Denver was named Tessa Orvind, and she had been promised not only Elmira's position but also improved quarters, and a salary that exceeded anything Elmira had ever received despite her years of faithful service. More disturbing were the specifics of the, quote, business opportunities that were being explored as alternatives for Elmira's future employment. Several mining camps had expressed interest in acquiring her services, offering prices that suggested they viewed skilled cooks as valuable commodities rather than human beings deserving of basic respect and consideration. The Black Hawk Creek mining operation had reportedly offered the highest bid, despite its reputation for brutal working conditions and its location in a canyon so remote that workers were essentially imprisoned by geography as much as by contractual obligations. The camp's previous cook had died under circumstances that remained officially unexplained, though rumors suggested that the combination of overwork, inadequate food, and deliberate neglect had contributed to her demise. Jasmine Orville, whose own advanced age made her useless for resale but gave her access to conversations from which younger staff members were excluded, reported that Arendor Valecrest was planning to complete all personnel changes before the end of August. The timing was driven partly by seasonal considerations, since autumn was the optimal period for establishing new working arrangements that would carry through the difficult winter months. But the urgency also reflected growing financial pressures that were affecting ranch operations despite their apparent prosperity. Cattle prices had fallen throughout 1852, mining investments had proved disappointing, and political expenses related to Arendor's territorial ambitions had consumed resources that might otherwise have been available for maintaining staff at previous levels. These economic realities meant that decisions about personnel were being driven primarily by short-term cost considerations rather than long-term operational benefits. Eliminating Elmira's position and selling her services to outside buyers would provide immediate income while reducing ongoing expenses, regardless of the impact on the quality of meals or the ranch's reputation for hospitality. The personal dimension of these economic calculations made them even more devastating for Elmira to contemplate. After 5 years of creating culinary masterpieces that enhanced the family's social standing and political influence, after enduring countless humiliations and sacrifices to maintain their household standards, after contributing her skills and labor to their success while receiving minimal compensation or recognition, she was being discarded like worn-out equipment that had outlived its usefulness. The psychological impact of this betrayal was compounded by the knowledge that no alternatives existed within the current system. Territorial law provided no protections for domestic workers in her situation. Local authorities had no interest in intervening in disputes between employers and employees, and the isolation of ranch life made it impossible to seek help from outside sources. Appeals to conscience or fairness would be pointless, since the Valecrest family had demonstrated repeatedly that they regarded her as property rather than as a human being deserving of basic consideration. Attempts to flee would be futile, since her lack of resources and legal documentation would make her vulnerable to recapture and punishment. For the first time in her adult life, Elmira began to understand that survival might require actions that violated every moral principle she had been taught to respect. The choice was becoming stark. Accept whatever fate others chose to impose on her, or seize control of her circumstances through means that would transform her from victim to perpetrator. In the kitchen, where she had spent 5 years perfecting recipes that brought pleasure to people who treated her with contempt, Elmira Fenwick began to consider possibilities that would have horrified the woman she had been just weeks earlier. The moment that transformed possibility into inevitability came during the early morning hours of August 20th, 1852, when Elmira discovered Callista Valecrest standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a document that would finalize the destruction of everything that remained of her former life. The paper bore the official seal of the territorial government in Denver, its legal language carefully crafted to disguise human trafficking as legitimate business transaction. Callista's presence in the kitchen at dawn was itself unusual, since she typically avoided the work areas during the hours when actual labor was being performed, but the satisfaction visible on her face suggested that she had chosen this moment specifically for maximum psychological impact, timing her announcement to coincide with Elmira's preparation of what would unknowingly become the family's final breakfast. "Elmira," Callista announced with the tone of voice reserved for particularly gratifying pieces of news, "we've finalized the arrangements we discussed last week. The Blackhawk Creek Mining Company has agreed to terms that will benefit everyone involved, and you'll be transferred to their operations by the end of this month." The document she held contained the specific details of a transaction that reduced 5 years of skilled labor and accumulated expertise to a simple commercial exchange. The mining company would pay the Valecrest family $300 for Elmira's services, along with assuming responsibility for her transportation to the mining camp and her maintenance during a 5-year employment contract that contained no provisions for early termination or renegotiation. $300. Less than the cost of the crystal chandelier that hung over the dining room table, where she would never again serve meals she had created with her own hands and artistic vision. Less than Arendor Valecrest spent on a single trip to Denver for political meetings. Less than the value of the silver serving pieces that displayed her culinary masterpieces to guests who praised her skills while treating her as invisible. The contract terms revealed the true nature of her destination with brutal clarity. 18-hour workdays, no days off. Meals consisting of basic rations that would barely maintain health under the demanding conditions of mining camp labor. Living quarters that amounted to a wooden bunk in a shared barracks with no privacy or security. Most significantly, the contract included provisions that would make escape impossible even if she survived the 5-year term. Any medical expenses, transportation costs, or equipment needs would be deducted from wages that were already set below subsistence levels, creating a debt burden that would grow larger rather than smaller over time. The mining company had perfected a system of economic slavery that operated within the legal framework of territorial employment law while ensuring that workers could never accumulate enough resources to buy their freedom. "The timing works perfectly," Callista continued with the enthusiasm of someone who had solved a complex logistical problem through superior planning. Mr. Valecrest has business in that area next week, so he can handle the transportation arrangements personally. That will save us the expense of hiring additional escort services and ensure that everything is handled properly. The casual mention of escort services revealed another layer of the degradation being planned for her future. Elmira would be transported to her new location under guard, like a criminal being transferred between prisons, her status as human property made explicit through the precautions necessary to prevent her from fleeing to freedom that existed only in her imagination. But it was Callista's next statement that crossed the line from economic exploitation into personal cruelty, transforming what might have been viewed as unfortunate business necessity into deliberate vindictiveness that demanded response. "I'm sure you'll appreciate the opportunity to experience a different kind of work environment," Callista said with a smile that revealed her understanding of exactly what conditions awaited Elmira at Blackhawk Creek. Mining camps are always looking for women who understand that hard work is the foundation of success in territorial life. I'm confident you'll fit in perfectly. The word women carried special meaning in the context of mining camps, where female workers were expected to provide services that extended far beyond cooking and cleaning. The men who worked the claims lived in conditions of extreme isolation and deprivation, their entertainment limited to whatever diversions could be purchased from the few women available in such remote locations. Callista understood perfectly well what she was condemning Elmira to endure, and her satisfaction in delivering this news revealed that the decision was motivated by more than simple economic considerations. This was punishment for years of perceived insubordination, revenge for every moment when Elmira's skills had made her temporarily indispensable, payback for the recognition her cooking had earned from guests who sometimes praised her abilities more enthusiastically than they complimented their hostess. The realization that her fate was being determined by petty jealousy and vindictive pleasure, rather than legitimate business needs, completed Elmira's transformation from victim to something far more dangerous. For 5 years, she had endured systematic dehumanization while telling herself that survival required acceptance of whatever treatment her circumstances imposed. She had absorbed countless humiliations while maintaining hope that patience and faithfulness might eventually earn her better treatment or possible freedom. But the document in Callista's hands represented the death of any such hope, proof that her loyalty and skills meant nothing to people who viewed her as an object to be discarded when convenient and sold when profitable. The mining camp contract was not just an employment arrangement but a death sentence, since few women survived 5 years under such conditions, and those who did were typically broken in body and spirit by experiences that destroyed everything recognizably human about their personalities. Standing in the kitchen where she had spent 5 years perfecting skills that would die with her in some remote mining camp, surrounded by ingredients and equipment that she would never again use to create the masterpieces that had been her only source of pride and identity, Elmira experienced a moment of perfect clarity about the choice she now faced. She could accept this fate with the resigned submission that had characterized her responses to previous injustices, allowing herself to be transported like livestock to a destination where her remaining years would be consumed by brutality that would make her current situation seem luxurious by comparison. Or she could seize control of her circumstances through actions that would ensure that if she was going to die, she would not die alone, and if she was going to be destroyed, she would not be destroyed without consequence for those who had orchestrated her destruction. The decision crystallized as she watched Callista fold the contract with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. In that moment, Elmira understood that the woman standing in her kitchen doorway had unknowingly sealed not only her fate, but the fate of everyone who would gather around the Valecrest dining room table for Sunday dinner on August 22nd. "I understand," Elmira said quietly, her voice carrying none of the distress or pleading that Callista had probably expected to hear. "Will there be anything special you'd like me to prepare for Sunday dinner before I leave? Perhaps something memorable that your guests will talk about for years to come?" The question was interpreted as evidence that Elmira had accepted her fate with appropriate gratitude, confirming Callista's belief that she had handled a difficult personnel matter with admirable firmness and clarity. The irony of that misunderstanding would become apparent only after it was far too late to matter. "That's very thoughtful of you," Callista replied with the condescending approval typically reserved for servants who demonstrated proper appreciation for their master's generosity. "Judge Varick will be joining us, along with Dr. Malrick and the Crestvales." I'm sure they would appreciate one of your special Sunday roasts, something that showcases the skills that have made you so valuable to our household." As Callista left the kitchen to attend to other matters, Elmira remained standing beside the preparation table, where she had created countless meals for people who regarded her as less than human. But for the first time in 5 years, she was planning a menu that would serve her own purposes rather than their pleasure. The Sunday dinner of August 22, 1852 would indeed be memorable, though not in any way that Callista Valecrest could have anticipated when she delivered the news that would trigger the most shocking crime in Colorado Territory history. In the pantry where she stored her spices and seasonings, Elmira located the tin of rat poison that had been purchased to control vermin in the grain storage areas. The white powder looked remarkably similar to several other ingredients she used regularly, a similarity that would prove crucial in the hours to come. The transformation from victim to perpetrator was now complete, though no one else in the Valecrest household had any reason to suspect that Sunday dinner would be anything other than another opportunity to display their wealth and sophistication to influential guests. They had created a monster through their systematic cruelty and casual indifference to human suffering. Soon they would meet that monster across their own dining room table, though they would never recognize her until it was far too late to escape the consequences of their own choices. The tin of rat poison sat innocuously among the other supplies in the kitchen pantry, its cheerful yellow label adorned with the smiling face of a well-dressed gentleman who promised complete elimination of household pests in bold red lettering. The manufacturer, Henderson Chemical Works of St. Louis, had designed the packaging to suggest reliability and respectability, never imagining that their product would soon serve purposes far removed from pest control in grain storage areas. Elmira held the container with hands that no longer trembled, studying the small print that revealed crucial information about the active ingredient and its effects on living creatures. Strychnine sulfate, derived from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, had become the preferred method for controlling rodent populations throughout the American territories because of its effectiveness in small doses and its relative stability during storage and transportation. But what made strychnine particularly suitable for rodent control also made it devastatingly effective against larger mammals, including humans. The chemical attacked the nervous system with systematic precision, causing muscle spasms that grew progressively more severe until they overwhelmed the victim's ability to breathe or maintain normal heart function. Death typically occurred within 30 to 60 minutes of ingestion, preceded by symptoms that were unmistakable once they began, but could easily be mistaken for other ailments during the crucial early stages. The knowledge Elmira needed to transform this agricultural chemical into an instrument of human destruction came from multiple sources that she had been unconsciously accumulating during her years at Copper Ridge Ranch. Dr. Carl Malrich, who would ironically become one of her victims, had discussed cases of accidental strychnine poisoning during dinner conversations with the Valecrest family, describing the symptoms and progression in clinical detail that revealed both the horror and the inevitability of such deaths. More specific information had come from Jasmine Orvell, whose previous employment at a ranch in Kansas had included caring for a rancher who had accidentally ingested rat poison while treating grain storage areas in darkness. Jasmine's account of the man's final hours had been intended as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper labeling and careful handling of dangerous chemicals. But it also provided Elmira with precise details about dosage, timing, and the progression of symptoms that would prove crucial for planning her attack. Additional insights came from conversations with ranch hands who had used strychnine for predator control, learning through trial and error how much poison was required to kill animals of various sizes, and how the chemical could be concealed in food to ensure consumption by the intended targets. Their casual discussions of technique and effectiveness had provided Elmira with practical knowledge that she could adapt for her own purposes. The most challenging aspect of her planning involved calculating the correct dosage for human victims while ensuring that the poison would be distributed evenly throughout the food and that its bitter taste would be adequately masked by other flavors. Strychnine possessed a distinctively metallic taste that could be detected by sensitive palates unless carefully disguised, and even small amounts of the chemical could cause suspicious reactions if not properly incorporated into the meal. Elmira's solution to this problem demonstrated the same attention to detail and creative problem-solving that had made her reputation as a cook. She would prepare a special seasoning mixture that incorporated the strychnine, along with strong flavored spices that would mask its presence while enhancing the overall taste of the Sunday roast. Salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and dried herbs would provide the foundation for a blend that could be applied to the meat during the final stages of cooking, ensuring even distribution while maintaining the appearance of normal meal preparation. The timing of the poisoning required equally careful consideration. The guests would begin arriving at 2 o'clock for social conversation and drinks before the 4 o'clock dinner service. This meant the fatal seasoning would need to be applied to the roast sometime between 3:30 and 3:45, allowing enough time for the flavors to penetrate the meat while ensuring that the poison remained stable and effective. More importantly, Elmira needed to ensure that she would not accidentally poison herself or any of the other staff members who might sample the food during preparation or cleanup. Her plan involved preparing a separate, smaller roast for the kitchen staff, using normal seasonings and cooking methods that would provide them with a safe meal, while the main roast carried death to the dining room. The psychological preparation for mass murder proved more challenging than the technical aspects of poison delivery. Despite the systematic cruelty she had endured and the horrific fate that awaited her at Blackhawk Creek Mining Company, Elmira had never previously contemplated taking human life, let alone the lives of multiple people simultaneously. The moral weight of what she was planning pressed against her consciousness like a physical burden, threatening to overwhelm her resolve before she could complete her preparations. But each time doubt crept into her planning, she would recall the satisfaction in Callista's voice as she described the opportunities awaiting Elmira at the mining camp, or remember the casual way Arendor Valecrest had discussed selling her services to the highest bidder, or think about the years of accumulated humiliation that had reduced her from a free woman with dreams and aspirations to a piece of property to be disposed of at convenience. These memories served to reinforce her conviction that the people she was planning to kill had forfeited any claim to moral consideration through their systematic dehumanization of others. They had created a system where human beings could be bought and sold like livestock, where skills and loyalty meant nothing compared to immediate profit, where the suffering of the powerless was treated as entertainment for the privileged. The rationalization process that allowed Elmira to proceed with her plans revealed the psychological mechanisms that ordinary people use to justify extraordinary violence. By convincing herself that her intended victims were fundamentally different from normal human beings, that they had chosen to place themselves outside the moral community through their actions, she was able to overcome the natural inhibitions against murder that would otherwise have made her plans impossible to execute. The guest list for Sunday dinner provided additional motivation for her resolve, since it represented a gathering of the territorial elite who had created and maintained the legal and social structures that made her situation possible. Judge Elias Varick had written legal opinions that reinforced the property rights of employers over their workers, ruling consistently that employment contracts took precedence over individual liberty when the two came into conflict. Dr. Carl Malrick had provided medical testimony in court cases involving disputes between employers and workers, invariably supporting the position that physical punishment and harsh working conditions were acceptable methods of maintaining discipline and productivity. His professional opinion had been used to justify treatment that would have been considered torture if applied to anyone with legal standing in territorial society. The Crestvale family had built their fortune through business practices that made the Valecrest treatment of workers seem benevolent by comparison, operating mining claims where workers routinely died from preventable accidents and deliberately maintaining dangerous conditions because the cost of safety improvements exceeded the expense of replacing dead employees. Even the ranch hands and domestic staff who would be joining the family for this special Sunday dinner had earned their places at the table through active participation in the system that oppressed people like Elmira. They had served as overseers, enforcers, and informants, using whatever small authority they possessed to curry favor with their employers while ensuring that resistance remained impossible. The moral complexity of her situation was further complicated by the presence of Kyla Valecrest, whose youth and apparent innocence made her inclusion in the planned massacre more difficult to justify. But Elmira had observed enough of the girl's behavior to understand that 16 years of privilege had already shaped her into someone who regarded servants as subhuman creatures whose suffering was invisible and irrelevant. Kyla had inherited her parents' casual cruelty along with their wealth, demonstrating the same indifference to the welfare of others and the same assumption that her comfort and convenience justified any amount of suffering by people she considered her inferiors. Her youth made her tragedy more poignant but not less deserving of the fate that awaited her. The final element of Elmira's preparation involved ensuring that she could complete her plan without being detected during the crucial hours before the poison took effect. This required maintaining her normal routine and emotional demeanor while making the technical preparations necessary for successful execution of 7 simultaneous murders. She practiced the motions of applying the poisoned seasoning until she could complete the process quickly and smoothly, appearing to be engaged in normal cooking activities even if someone happened to observe her during the critical moments. She rehearsed casual conversation that would deflect any questions about unusual ingredients or preparation methods, preparing explanations that would satisfy curiosity without arousing suspicion. Most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the role she would need to play during the dinner itself, when she would be required to serve the poisoned meal while maintaining the facade of loyal service that had characterized her behavior for 5 years. She would need to appear concerned and helpful when the symptoms began, shocked and horrified when the deaths occurred, and confused and devastated when the investigation began. The woman who had once taken pride in creating culinary masterpieces that brought pleasure to others was now focused on perfecting a different kind of creation, one that would deliver justice instead of satisfaction and revenge instead of nourishment. The skills that had made her invaluable as a cook would now serve her as an instrument of execution, transforming the kitchen where she had been systematically dehumanized into the planning center for the most shocking crime in Colorado Territory history. On the morning of August 21st, Elmira completed her final preparations with the methodical thoroughness that had always characterized her approach to cooking. She measured the strychnine with the same precision she had once used for exotic spices, mixed it with complementary seasonings using techniques perfected through years of practice, and stored the deadly mixture in a container that appeared identical to dozens of other seasoning blends in her kitchen arsenal. The Sunday roast that would carry death to the Valecrest dining room was already selected and prepared for cooking, a magnificent piece of beef that would normally have been the centerpiece of a celebration. By tomorrow evening, it would be the centerpiece of a crime scene that would shock the American West and launch a manhunt that would span multiple territories. But first, Elmira Fenwick needed to sleep, gathering strength for the performance of her lifetime. When she woke on Sunday morning, she would begin the final day of her service as the Valecrest family cook, a service that would end with a meal none of them would survive to remember. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold across the Colorado Territory, the August sun struggling to burn through high mountain air that carried the crisp promise of early autumn. At Copper Ridge Ranch, the familiar sounds of daily routine echoed across the compound. Horses snorting in their corrals, cattle lowing in distant pastures, and the rhythmic thud of axes as ranch hands split wood for the kitchen fires that would soon be needed for the elaborate Sunday dinner preparation. Elmira woke before sunrise, as she had every morning for 5 years, her internal clock calibrated to the demands of feeding a household that expected meals to appear with clockwork precision, regardless of weather, circumstances, or the physical condition of those responsible for their preparation. But this morning carried a weight different from all the others that had preceded it, a sense of finality that made every familiar task feel like a ritual being performed for the last time. She dressed in her usual work clothes, the plain brown dress and white apron that marked her status as clearly as any uniform, taking care with details that normally received minimal attention. Today, her appearance would be scrutinized by investigators who would search for any sign that she had been planning something extraordinary, any deviation from routine that might have warned observant household members of the catastrophe about to unfold. The kitchen welcomed her with its familiar blend of aromas, wood smoke from banked fires, residual spices from previous meals, the lingering scent of yeast from yesterday's bread baking. These smells had once provided comfort during the long hours of solitary labor, but now they seemed to mock her with reminders of the life she was about to destroy, along with the lives of those who had made that destruction necessary. Her first task involved lighting the massive cast-iron stove that would provide the heat needed for roasting the beef that would serve as the centerpiece of the Sunday dinner. The process required careful attention to airflow and fuel management, building a fire that would maintain steady temperatures for the hours of cooking ahead. Under normal circumstances, this technical challenge provided satisfaction through the application of hard-won expertise. But today, the familiar motions felt mechanical, performed by hands that belonged to someone else. The Sunday roast itself waited in the cold storage room, a magnificent piece of beef that represented the best of what Copper Ridge Ranch could produce. Weighing nearly 12 pounds and marbled with fat that would render during cooking to create the rich flavors that had built a reputation, it should have been the foundation for another triumph of culinary artistry. Instead, it would serve as the delivery mechanism for the most concentrated act of revenge in territorial history. Elmira carried the roast to her preparation table, examining its surface with the critical eye of someone whose professional reputation depended on perfection in every detail. The meat required careful trimming to remove excess fat and sinew, then scoring to allow seasoning to penetrate deeply into the flesh. These preparatory steps demanded the same meticulous attention she had always devoted to her craft, regardless of the purposes for which that craft would now be employed. The poisoned seasoning mixture waited in its innocuous container, indistinguishable from the dozens of other spice blends that lined her pantry shelves. She had prepared it with the same careful attention to balance and proportion that characterized all her culinary creations, ensuring that the strychnine would be evenly distributed, while its bitter taste remained masked by complementary flavors that would enhance rather than compromise the overall dining experience. As the morning progressed, other members of the household staff began their own preparations for the Sunday dinner that would host 7 of the most influential people in 3 counties. Jasmine Orville arrived to help with cleaning and table setting, her arthritis making each movement painful, but her determination to fulfill her duties overriding physical limitations that would have defeated someone with alternatives. The interaction between the 2 women carried special poignancy since Jasmine represented the only person in the household who had shown Elmira genuine kindness and concern during the years of systematic degradation. But revealing her plans to Jasmine would have served no purpose except to burden an elderly woman with knowledge that could only bring her pain and possibly place her in legal jeopardy when the investigation began. Instead, Elmira maintained the facade of normal preparation while secretly observing Jasmine's movements and ensuring that the older woman would not accidentally consume any of the poisoned food during the evening service. She prepared a separate, smaller portion of beef using normal seasonings, claiming that it was intended for the kitchen staff's own meal and should be cooked separately to avoid any confusion during the formal service. The deception required constant vigilance and careful planning, since any suspicious behavior might alert someone to the danger that was systematically being built into the evening's menu. Elmira had to appear completely normal while simultaneously executing the most complex and dangerous plan of her life, maintaining casual conversation while calculating dosages that would ensure death without immediate detection. The psychological strain of this performance began to manifest in ways that she struggled to control. Her hands trembled slightly while handling the poisoned seasoning, requiring multiple attempts to achieve the even distribution essential for her planned success. Her voice carried a higher pitch than usual when responding to questions from other staff members, though none of them seemed to notice the difference in someone whose emotional state had never been considered worthy of attention. Most challenging was the need to maintain her normal relationship with the Valecrest family members as they moved through the house preparing for their guests' arrival. Callista appeared in the kitchen multiple times throughout the morning, offering suggestions and criticism that would normally have been received with resigned acceptance but now felt like evidence being presented at her own trial. "I want everything perfect today," Callista announced during one of these supervisory visits, her tone carrying the particular emphasis that suggested unstated consequences for failure. "Judge Varick has been looking forward to your cooking for weeks, and Dr. Malrick specifically requested that we serve your famous Sunday roast. Don't disappoint us." The irony of these expectations was so profound that Elmira had to struggle against inappropriate laughter that threatened to reveal the true nature of her mental state. The very people who had condemned her to a future of brutality and degradation were now depending on her skills to enhance their social standing and political influence, never imagining that those same skills were being turned against them with methodical precision. "Of course, Mrs. Valecrest," Elmira replied with the submissive tone that had characterized all her interactions with the family for 5 years. "I've prepared something special that I'm sure everyone will remember." The morning hours passed with agonizing slowness as Elmira completed the technical preparations while maintaining the emotional control necessary to avoid detection. The roast required constant attention as it cooked, with regular basting and temperature monitoring to ensure the perfect texture and flavor that would make the poisoned seasoning's bitter aftertaste undetectable until far too late for any intervention. By noon, the first guests had begun arriving, their carriages raising dust clouds visible from the kitchen windows as they approached the main house. Judge Varick and his wife arrived punctually, followed closely by Dr. Malrick and the Crestvale family members, who had been granted the privilege of dining with their social superiors. Each arrival represented another life that would end before sunset, another person whose participation in the system of oppression had earned them a place at Elmira's table of judgment. The social rituals that preceded the formal dinner service provided Elmira with her final opportunities to complete the poisoning process without detection. While the guests gathered in the main parlor for drinks and conversation, she applied the fatal seasoning to the roast with movements that appeared to be normal food preparation, but were actually the precise execution of 7 carefully planned murders. The strychnine-laced mixture adhered perfectly to the meat's surface, creating an even coating that would ensure uniform distribution when the roast was carved for serving. The complementary spices masked any visual evidence of the poison while enhancing the aromatic qualities that would make the dish appealing to guests who had traveled considerable distances specifically to enjoy her cooking. As 4 o'clock approached and the dinner service prepared to begin, Elmira experienced a moment of perfect clarity about the irreversible step she was taking. Within hours, 7 people would be dead by her hand, their bodies arranged around the Valecrest dining room table in a tableau of justice that would shock the American West and launch investigations that might eventually lead to her capture and execution. But the alternative was accepting transportation to Black Hawk Creek Mining Company, where she would endure years of brutality that would destroy her body and soul, while enriching the same people who had already consumed 5 years of her life without offering even minimal compensation or basic human dignity in return. Between those two fates, the choice was clear, even if the moral weight of multiple murders would haunt whatever remained of her conscience. The carving of the roast proceeded with the ceremonial precision that marked all formal dinners at Copper Ridge Ranch. Elmira arranged the slices on the finest china plates, adding complementary vegetables and garnishes that transformed each serving into a work of culinary art. The presentation was flawless, worthy of the reputation that had made her services sought after throughout 3 counties. 7 plates, each containing a carefully measured dose of death disguised as hospitality. 7 portions of beef that would deliver justice to people who had never imagined that their victims possessed the knowledge and determination necessary for such comprehensive revenge. 7 final meals that would transform Sunday dinner into the Last Supper for everyone gathered around the Valecrest table. As she carried the first plates toward the dining room, Elmira reflected on the bitter irony that her greatest culinary achievement would also be her final one, a masterpiece that no one would survive to praise or remember. The skills that had made her invaluable as a cook were now serving her as an instrument of execution, completing a transformation from victim to perpetrator that the Valecrest family had made inevitable through their systematic cruelty and casual indifference to human suffering. The dining room doors opened before her, revealing the gathering of territorial elite who had unknowingly assembled for their own execution. In a few minutes they would begin consuming the meal that would kill them all, never suspecting that their trusted cook had become their judge, jury, and executioner. The Sunday dinner of August 22, 1852, was about to begin. The Valecrest dining room had been transformed into a showcase of territorial elegance, with crystal glasses catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows draped in imported silk. The mahogany table, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the faces of 7 people who had gathered to celebrate their shared prosperity and social prominence, unaware that they were actually attending their own execution. Arendor Valecrest sat at the head of the table with the satisfied bearing of a man who had built an empire through shrewd calculation and ruthless determination. His wife Callista occupied the opposite end, her position allowing her to oversee both the service and the social dynamics that would determine the success of this carefully orchestrated gathering. Between them sat their guests, arranged according to the complex protocols that govern such occasions in territorial society. Judge Elias Varick commanded the place of honor to Arendor's right, his presence lending legal authority to whatever business discussions might emerge during the evening. His wife Maeva sat beside him, her conversation already animated by the wine that had accompanied the preliminary courses. Dr. Carl Malrick occupied the corresponding position of respect to Callista's left, his medical expertise making him a valued counselor on matters affecting the health and welfare of the ranch community. The remaining seats were filled by Aaron Crestvale, the ranch foreman whose years of faithful service had earned him inclusion in this elevated company, and young Kyla Valecrest, whose presence represented both family continuity and the social accomplishments that her parents hoped to display to their distinguished guests. Elmira entered the dining room carrying the first serving platter with movements that appeared completely normal despite the extraordinary nature of what she was delivering. The poisoned roast had been carved with her usual artistic precision, each slice arranged to showcase the perfect texture and rich color that had made her reputation throughout 3 counties. The complimentary vegetables and garnishes completed presentations that would have been worthy of the finest restaurants in Denver or Colorado Springs. Magnificent as always, Judge Varick announced as his plate was placed before him, his appreciation genuine despite his inability to imagine that the woman serving him had spent days planning his death. "Mrs. Valecrest, you continue to employ the finest cook in the territory." The compliment carried bitter irony that only Elmira could fully appreciate, since the skills being praised were the same ones that would soon deliver justice to people who had never considered that their victims might possess the knowledge and determination necessary for such comprehensive revenge. She accepted the praise with the same submissive demeanor that had characterized all her interactions with the household's social superiors, giving no indication that she was observing each guest with the focused attention of someone monitoring the effectiveness of carefully calculated murder. The conversation that accompanied the meal covered the familiar topics that dominated such gatherings: territorial politics, cattle prices, mining developments, and the social changes that rapid population growth was bringing to Colorado. Judge Varick spoke knowledgeably about legal precedents being established by the territorial courts, while Dr. Malrick offered observations about public health challenges facing communities that were growing faster than their infrastructure could accommodate. Arendor Valecrest dominated the discussion with updates on his own business ventures, describing cattle contracts that would supply beef to mining camps throughout the region and political connections that might prove valuable when Colorado eventually achieved statehood. His wife contributed observations about social developments in Denver and the opportunities that territorial growth was creating for families, with the vision and resources to capitalize on changing circumstances. The poisoned beef was consumed with the appreciation that Elmira's cooking had always generated, each guest praising the perfect seasoning and tender texture that made Copper Ridge Ranch dinners legendary throughout the region. None of them detected the bitter aftertaste that strychnine produced, since the complementary spices had been chosen specifically to mask that particular characteristic while enhancing the overall flavor profile. 30 minutes passed before the first symptoms appeared, beginning subtly enough that they could easily be attributed to overindulgence or the effects of wine consumption. Dr. Malrick was the first to experience the muscle tension that preceded more serious manifestations, his medical training making him more sensitive to unusual physical sensations that others might have initially ignored. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his chair with movements that appeared slightly unsteady. "I seem to be experiencing some digestive discomfort. Perhaps I've been too enthusiastic in my appreciation of this excellent meal." The comment generated sympathetic laughter from other guests who assumed they were witnessing nothing more serious than the consequences of overindulgence at a particularly successful dinner party. But within minutes, similar complaints began emerging around the table as the strychnine reached concentrations sufficient to affect normal nervous system function. Judge Varick reported sudden onset of muscle cramps that made sitting comfortable difficult, while his wife began experiencing the nausea and dizziness that characterized early stages of poisoning. Young Kyla complained of burning sensations in her throat and stomach, symptoms that her parents initially attributed to her inexperience with rich food and adult dining customs. The transformation from social gathering to medical emergency occurred with shocking speed once the poison reached critical concentrations in their bloodstreams. Dr. Malrick's professional training allowed him to recognize that they were dealing with something far more serious than simple indigestion. But his own deteriorating condition made it difficult for him to provide effective diagnosis or treatment. "Something is wrong," he announced with growing urgency, his voice beginning to show the strain that muscular spasms were placing on his respiratory system. "These symptoms suggest poisoning. We need to induce vomiting immediately and send for medical assistance from town." But the nearest doctor was 12 miles away in Millhaven, and the strychnine was already too deeply absorbed into their systems for such interventions to provide meaningful relief. The poison attacked their nervous systems with systematic efficiency, causing muscle contractions that grew progressively more severe until they overwhelmed the victim's ability to breathe or maintain normal heart function. Callista Valecrest was the first to understand that they were facing something beyond medical intervention, her social composure crumbling as she watched her carefully planned dinner party transform into a scene of systematic death. Her accusations began immediately, focusing on the only person present who had not consumed the fatal meal. "What did you do?" she gasped, her words barely intelligible through the spasms that were beginning to distort her facial muscles. "What did you put in our food?" Elmira maintained the facade of shocked innocence that she had rehearsed during her preparation, appearing as confused and horrified as someone who had accidentally poisoned the people she served would naturally be expected to appear. Her performance was flawless, convincing even herself momentarily that she was witnessing an inexplicable tragedy rather than the successful execution of carefully planned revenge. "I don't understand," she replied with apparent desperation. "I prepared everything exactly as I always do. Maybe something was wrong with the meat. Or the seasonings went bad somehow. Should I ride for help?" The offer to seek assistance was both genuine and futile, since the distances involved and the advanced stage of the poisoning made rescue impossible, even if she had immediately departed for Millhaven. But the gesture reinforced her apparent innocence while providing her with an excuse to leave the dining room if the scene became too difficult to witness. The deaths occurred with the methodical precision that strychnine poisoning produced, each victim succumbing as their nervous system lost the ability to coordinate essential functions. Judge Viereck died first, his legal authority powerless against the justice that Elmira had served at his own dinner plate. Dr. Malrick followed within minutes, his medical knowledge insufficient to save him from a poison that had been administered with perfect calculation. The others followed in rapid succession: Maeva Viereck, Aaron Crestvale, and finally the Valecrest family themselves. Callista died still trying to voice accusations that her failing respiratory system could no longer articulate, while Arendor succumbed with the bewildered expression of someone who had never imagined that his power could be so easily neutralized by someone he had regarded as property. Kyla was the last to die, her youth prolonging her struggle against the poison that was systematically shutting down her body's essential functions. Her final moments were spent looking directly at Elmira, with eyes that seemed to recognize, too late, that their trusted cook had become their executioner. By sunset, 7 bodies sat arranged around the Valecrest dining room table in a tableau that would haunt investigators for years to come. The finest china and crystal still held the remnants of what should have been a celebration of territorial prosperity, while the elaborate Sunday roast sat partially consumed on its silver serving platter, its remaining portions containing enough poison to kill dozens of additional victims. Elmira stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, surveying the results of her systematic revenge with emotions that she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. The people who had condemned her to a future of brutality and degradation were now beyond the reach of earthly justice, their power neutralized by someone they had never considered capable of such comprehensive retaliation. The transformation from victim to perpetrator was now complete and irreversible. 7 lives had been taken in payment for 5 years of systematic dehumanization, and the woman who had once taken pride in creating culinary masterpieces had become the architect of the most shocking mass murder in Colorado Territory history. But the immediate satisfaction of successful revenge was already being complicated by the knowledge that her own survival now depended on escaping into a wilderness that offered no guarantees, and facing a future that held no certainties beyond the inevitability of pursuit and possible capture. The hunt for Elmira Fenwick was about to begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.